Florida real estate right now looks like a mess from the outside. Insurance bills doubling, coastal markets cooling, headlines about corrections and overbuilding, and the whole thing coming apart. And if you're watching all that and thinking, okay, maybe Florida is just done as a place to buy, that is exactly the reaction the data says is wrong, because buried inside that same data, a completely different story is playing out. Population growth numbers that don't make sense if the market is falling apart. Move-in ratios pointing to specific zip codes pulling in far more residents than they're losing. Towns that never made the boom era lists, partly because they were never overbuilt, never overspeculated, never inflated by investor money chasing a quick flip. They just kept growing quietly while everyone's attention was parked on Miami. Now here's what actually connects these places. Two forces are reshaping where people are buying in Florida right now. The first is insurance. Coastal premiums have crossed $5,000 a year in large parts of the state, and that number is not coming back down. It's a structural repricing of risk, not a temporary spike. Every town on this list benefits from dramatically lower premiums because of where it sits geographically. We're talking $1,800 to $3,500 a year in annual costs versus $5,000 plus on the coast. That's not a small difference. It's the difference between a budget that works and one that doesn't, especially for anyone living on a fixed retirement income. The second force is the Live Local Act, Florida's state-level policy that hands developers tax credits to build affordable and workforce housing in specific corridors. Some of these towns have both forces operating at the same time. Organic migration pressure from displaced coastal buyers landing on top of state-backed supply investment. When that happens, the growth runway is long, and it's not dependent on speculation or optimism. It's backed by policy dollars and demographic math. 10 towns. The numbers say they're just getting started, and for retirees or anyone planning a move in the next year or two, the specific reasons these places stand out. Affordable home prices still under $260,000 in some cases, insurance costs that actually fit a retirement budget, healthcare infrastructure that's growing rather than shrinking, and the kind of community stability that doesn't depend on the market staying hot matter more than any growth headline. These aren't speculative plays dressed up as retirement destinations. They're places where the fundamentals already work and the price hasn't caught up yet. Here are 10 Florida towns nobody is talking about that are about to boom in 2026. Lakeland. Start here, because Lakeland is the one that already proved the thesis and still hasn't hit a ceiling. Move Buddha named it the fastest growing boomtown in America. Its population is closing in on 130,000, up more than 34% over the last decade, and its move-in to out ratio sits at 1.33, meaning for every 100 people leaving, 133 are arriving. That ratio matters more than a raw head count because it measures net pull. It tells you that people are choosing Lakeland over other options available to them repeatedly at a high enough rate to register in the national data. The reason isn't complicated. Lakeland sits in the dead center of the Tampa-Orlando labor corridor. Workers can access both job markets without paying to live inside either one. The logistics and distribution industry has built a serious footprint here. Warehouses, fulfillment centers, regional hubs, and that expansion is still in progress. There is real paycheck-generating employment anchoring the migration, not just lifestyle appeal or affordable prices alone. Then there's the insurance picture. In the Tampa City core, windstorm premiums have become a significant line item in the true cost of home ownership. Lakeland, sitting inland, avoids the windstorm surcharge entirely. Residents here are paying a fraction of what coastal buyers pay to ensure comparable square footage, and that gap shows up every single year of ownership. It doesn't appear on the listing price, which is exactly why buyers who understand total cost of ownership keep ending up here. The question most people ask about Lakeland is whether the window has already closed. The logistics build-out is still adding capacity, and the Tampa and Orlando metros are still pricing people out at a steady rate. The answer, for now, is probably not yet. For retirees specifically, the combination of a functioning job market nearby, inland insurance rates, and a population that's growing rather than aging in place means the services and amenities that make a retirement destination livable are being funded and expanded here. That's not guaranteed in slower-growing inland towns. Lakeland earns the top spot because it anchors this list as the confirmation that the inland shift is real and has already moved past the early adopter phase. Eagle Lake. Eagle Lake. Population, small enough that most people would need to look it up. Growth rate, 33% in a single year, the fastest in the state for the period covering 2023 into 2024. Sit with that number for a second. 33% single year population growth in a tiny Polk County town that sits directly next door to Lakeland. That's not a trend line. That's a signal that something structural is happening in a place that most real estate coverage hasn't gotten around to mentioning. What's happening is overflow, and it's predictable once you understand the dynamic. Lakeland is getting noticed at a national level. Land inside Lakeland is getting bought. Developers and buyers who want to be in that Central Florida logistics corridor but can't find available parcels or can't find them at a price that still pencils have moved one town over. Eagle Lake has land. Eagle Lake is still priced at a level that reflects obscurity rather than demand. That gap between actual demand and perceived demand is where the opportunity sits. The people showing up in Eagle Lake's growth numbers are not investors doing short-term plays. They are workers who need to live within range of the employment that Lakeland's expansion has created, and they are landing in Eagle Lake when Lakeland's inventory runs thin. That's about as organic as demand gets. No speculative flipping, no investor-driven price inflation, just people who need a place to live near the jobs. Finding the town next door still has room. Almost zero media coverage exists on Eagle Lake. No listicles, no investment blog deep dives, no viral Reddit threads. That absence is itself information. Price discovery hasn't caught up to demand yet, and it usually doesn't until the coverage arrives. By the time it does, the gap tends to be smaller. Davenport, the next town on this list, has already gone through the first phase of that discovery process, and what came out the other side is something worth paying close attention to. Davenport. Davenport used to mean one thing to anyone paying attention to Florida real estate: short-term vacation rental homes within driving distance of the theme parks. Investor-owned, managed remotely, rented out by the week to families on vacation. That was the town's economic identity, and it served a function in the broader tourism ecosystem. That identity is actively changing, and the data behind the change is hard to argue with. The population has surged more than 120% since 2020. The annualized growth rate has been running near 9.5%. But more important than the size of the growth is the composition of who is moving here. Families priced out of the Orlando core are showing up as permanent residents, not as investors acquiring a rental property. They're choosing Davenport for I-4 access, for modern infrastructure that has been built to accommodate growth, and for value per square foot that still beats nearly everything else in the Orlando metro radius at comparable price points. That shift from speculative to residential demand is a stabilizing signal. Speculative demand is elastic. Investors exit when the numbers stop working. Residential demand sticks. People who moved their family to Davenport because it was the most affordable realistic entry point into the Orlando area don't flip the house 6 months later because market sentiment shifted. They're there because their kids go to school there, because their commute is manageable, because their mortgage payment is something they can actually sustain. The transition in Davenport isn't complete. There are still investor-owned short-term rentals in the mix. But the trajectory is clear enough that Davenport deserves a different conversation than the one the market was having about it 2 or 3 years ago. The place is growing up, and the people driving that growth are putting down actual roots. For retirees looking at the Orlando metro area as a possibility, Davenport now offers something the core doesn't: room, physical room, and budget room, both of which are increasingly hard to find inside the metro itself. Groveland, sitting further west in Lake County, is at an even earlier stage of that same transition, and the price reflects it. Groveland. Lake County sits west of Orlando, and Claremont tends to collect the attention when people talk about affordable options in that area. Nice lakes, room to breathe, reasonable drive to the metro. Claremont has a reputation, and its prices now reflect that reputation. Groveland is Claremont's cheaper neighbor to the west, and most of what's being written about Florida real estate has not gotten around to it yet. The population more than doubled since 2020. Not grew meaningfully, doubled. For a small town, that kind of growth in a compressed window is the type of signal that shows up clearly in hindsight and makes people say the opportunity was obvious. Right now, it's not obvious, which is why it's still on the right side of the pricing curve. The mechanism here is infrastructure sequencing, and it matters. Road expansion projects are arriving in Lake County, and when access to a location improves, the price of that location adjusts. Buyers pay for accessibility, and they pay more of it as accessibility increases. Groveland is currently priced for its current road network, its current commute times, its current level of convenience. Once those infrastructure upgrades close the practical distance gap between Groveland and the broader Orlando metro, that pricing equation shifts. The buyers entering now are doing so before that adjustment happens, which is the definition of buying ahead of the curve rather than chasing it. The lifestyle comparison to Claremont is legitimate. The lakes are there. The space is there. The general Central Florida access is there. The price difference is the only meaningful gap, and that gap narrows when the roads catch up. For a buyer or retiree who is willing to be slightly ahead of the infrastructure curve in exchange for a meaningfully lower entry price, Groveland is the version of this trade that still exists in the greater Orlando area. From the infrastructure play, the next town makes its case on a completely different basis. One that's less about what's coming and more about what the numbers already show every single year you own there. Ocala. Ocala makes the most direct argument of any town on this list, and the argument is built almost entirely on what you don't pay. Homeowners insurance in Ocala runs between $1,800 and $2,400 a year on average. On the Florida coast, that same coverage on a comparable home can exceed $5,000 annually. The gap, roughly $2,600 or more per year, is a fixed cost advantage that compounds over time in a way that a slightly lower listing price does not. A lower listing price lowers your mortgage payment once. A lower insurance bill lowers your monthly costs every year for every year you own the home. Across a 20-year retirement, that difference adds up to more than $50,000 that stays in your pocket rather than going to a carrier. For anyone making decisions about where to spend retirement on a fixed income, that math is not abstract. It's the difference between a budget that holds and one that slowly doesn't. The median home price in Ocala still sits under $260,000. Healthcare sector employment is expanding in the area, which adds a demand floor that is largely recession resistant. Healthcare jobs don't evaporate the way construction or hospitality jobs do when the economy slows. And the inland geography means no hurricane surge zone, no windstorm classification, no exposure to the coastal risk repricing that has made parts of South Florida either uninsurable or insured only at prohibitive costs. The long-term framing here is about what happens if coastal insurance trends continue, and nothing in the current trajectory suggests they reverse. Ocala's location advantage becomes more pronounced over time, not less. Buyers who understood that early are the ones who benefit most from the widening gap between what coastal ownership costs and what inland ownership costs. The window to be one of those buyers is still open, but it has a timer on it. As more retirees run the insurance math and land on the same conclusion, the competitive advantage of arriving in Ocala before that realization goes mainstream compresses. Tallahassee makes a related but structurally different argument, one that's less about geographic safety and more about economic architecture. Tallahassee. Most Florida real estate markets move with the private sector. When construction slows, when migration cools, when interest rates push buyers to the sideline, demand softens and inventory backs up. Tallahassee is built to be structurally different from that pattern, and it has been for a long time. State government is the economic base here. Florida State University and Florida A&M University are anchored here. These are not employers that contract when the real estate market turns or when a national recession trims private payrolls. State workers keep their positions, university faculty and staff keep their jobs, students keep arriving every fall and needing somewhere to live. The rental market in Tallahassee doesn't follow the same boom-bust cycle that private sector-dependent markets follow because the demand is tied to institutional calendars and government budgets rather than to developer confidence or investor sentiment. In practice, this means that when inland cities like Tallahassee are described as offering the best value in the state right now, the claim is backed by something more durable than a favorable price-to-income ratio. The stability is built in. You're not buying into appreciation speculation. You're buying into a market with a structural demand floor that has held through multiple economic cycles and shows no reason to change. For buyers who watched the boom era volatility and prices running up 30% in 2 years, then cooling, then uncertainty, Tallahassee offers something that is genuinely rare in the Florida market, a place where boring is the strategy. Insurance costs here remain well below the coastal rates. Inventory stays reasonably tight because institutional demand never fully goes away. If what you want from a real estate purchase is a lack of drama and a high probability that your asset holds value across a long time horizon, Tallahassee is one of the strongest cases in the state. Homestead. Miami-Dade has run out of affordable geography. That is not a figure of speech. It is a physical and financial fact. The metro has expanded in every direction it realistically can, and the prices that expansion carried with it have effectively closed off entry-level access across most of the county. If you want Miami Metro access at a price that a normal household income can support, the geography has been narrowing for years, and it is now nearly closed. Homestead is the last corridor where it isn't. Sitting at the southern edge of Miami-Dade, Homestead is the final entry point into the metro at a price point that still reflects where things were rather than where they've gone. The Live Local Act is specifically directing developer tax credits into this area, which means the affordable and workforce housing pipeline here is not dependent on organic developer interest alone. It's backed and subsidized by state policy. When supply is incentivized at the policy level, it has a predictability and a staying power that purely market-driven supply doesn't. Developers are building here because the economics of building here have been made to work through tax credits, and that pipeline continues as long as the policy continues. The proximity to the Miami metro ecosystem doesn't require much elaboration for anyone familiar with South Florida. The employment base, the medical infrastructure, the international airport, the commercial corridors, all of it is accessible from Homestead. The buyer here is not sacrificing metro access to get a lower price. They are buying into the same metro at a materially different number through the only geographic entry point that still makes that possible. There is no cheaper neighbor to the south. That scarcity is structural, not cyclical, and the runway for growth here reflects it. Gainesville. The University of Florida creates a guarantee that most real estate markets simply cannot offer: permanent, non-negotiable demand for housing that does not respond to economic cycles. Students arrive every fall regardless of what mortgage rates are doing. Faculty and staff need homes regardless of what the Florida Peninsula's real estate market is doing broadly. That baseline demand is tied to enrollment, which is driven by a major state university system that isn't relocating or contracting. Even through periods when the broader Florida market has seen inventory fluctuate and buyer sentiment cool, Gainesville's rental demand has stayed tight because the population generating that demand operates on its own schedule. For buyers specifically, the insurance number tells a clear story. On a $250,000 home in Gainesville, annual premiums run somewhere between $2,800 and $3,500. That is a fraction of what comparable coverage costs in coastal Florida markets. For a retiree calculating whether a property makes financial sense, either as a primary residence or as an income-generating rental, that difference in carrying cost is material to the monthly math. What often goes unmentioned about Gainesville is the quality of infrastructure a major university creates for everyone in the city, not just people affiliated with the school, the medical facilities that come with a large university health system, the cultural programming, the restaurants, the walkable commercial corridors. A retiree who has no connection to the University of Florida still benefits from everything the institution builds around itself. Low insurance costs, permanent rental demand, and a college town amenity base in a small city footprint. That combination doesn't show up in many markets. Jacksonville. Jacksonville is one of the few metro areas in Florida where the mid-2026 data looks genuinely balanced rather than stressed in either direction. Inventory has come back down to roughly a 4-month supply, the kind of reading that signals real demand absorbing real supply, not a market in distress and not one running hot enough to overheat. For anyone looking for a sign that buyers are returning to a market for the right reasons rather than speculative ones, a 4-month inventory number is about as readable a signal as you get. The growth in Clay and St. Johns counties is organic in a specific and important way. It is driven by school quality. St. Johns County's school district is consistently rated among the top in Florida, and that reputation is a primary reason families relocating from the Midwest and Northeast are landing in this part of the state rather than somewhere else. School-driven demand is sticky in a way that almost no other demand driver matches. Families who move specifically because of the schools don't leave when market conditions shift. The next wave of families looking to follow doesn't stop because of sentiment. They stop when prices move out of reach, and prices in Clay and St. Johns counties haven't done that. The Jacksonville metro job market adds the macro support layer. The employment base here is diverse enough that a contraction in one sector doesn't cascade through the entire local economy the way it might in a single industry market. That diversity keeps demand across the housing market from being fragile. For anyone who wants Florida lifestyle, weather, no state income tax, outdoor access, without paying the tourist town premium or the coastal insurance premium, Jacksonville's suburban counties are a consistent answer, not a flashy one, a durable one. Lake Worth and Boynton Beach. Palm Beach County has a pricing problem for anyone who isn't already inside the market. Boca Raton and Delray Beach have maintained elevated price points, and buyers who want access to Palm Beach County's ecosystem without Palm Beach County's price tags have been pushed to look elsewhere. The direction they're looking is slightly north, to Lake Worth and the Boynton Beach area, where the Live Local Act is now funding neighborhood revitalization, and where the displacement pressure from the south is landing. The dynamic here is straightforward. Proximity to Palm Beach County's infrastructure is valuable, and that value has not yet been fully priced into these neighborhoods the way it has been priced into Boca and Delray. The hospitals are close, the employment base is close, the commercial corridors, the cultural amenities, the airport access, all of it is reachable. Buyers in Lake Worth and Boynton Beach are not giving up the Palm Beach County ecosystem. They are buying into it through a zip code that still hasn't fully priced in the access it offers. The Live Local Act investment accelerates what would happen organically anyway. State-backed revitalization in a neighborhood that already has strong proximity value compresses the timeline for price discovery. Projects that improve streetscapes, add density, and bring in workforce housing don't just benefit the people moving into those units. They change the perception of the surrounding blocks, which changes what buyers are willing to pay for addresses nearby. Boca Raton and Delray Beach are not getting cheaper. The southward pricing pressure on Lake Worth and Boynton Beach is therefore not a temporary condition waiting to ease. It is a structural feature of being the next county down from a market that has priced out most of its own demand. The buyers who move first on that dynamic are the ones who get the most of it before pricing reflects what the access is actually worth. The pattern across all 10 of these towns points to the same underlying shift. The pressure that's making coastal Florida harder to own, inshore, and to hold long-term is generating demand in specific other places. And those places are still priced like the market hasn't noticed. The move-in ratios, the population growth numbers, the insurance differentials, each of them is measuring a different part of the same structural migration away from the coast. Some of these towns will stay under the radar for another year or two. Eagle Lake and Groveland probably have the longest window simply because they are small enough and obscure enough that the coverage cycle hasn't caught up to what the data is already showing. Lake Worth and Boynton Beach are slightly further along. The Live Local Act money is visible enough that some buyers are already paying attention. Lakeland, of course, is no longer a secret, but the build-out that made it a secret worth knowing about is still in progress. The consistent pattern in markets like these is that the data shows up in the population numbers before it shows up in the headlines, and it shows up in the headlines before it shows up in the price. The buyers who do best are the ones who act on the first signal rather than waiting for the third. Every town on this list is still somewhere between the first and second signal. That window does not stay open indefinitely.